Well, hello there and welcome to this, the 198th edition of DF Direct Weekly. We're closing in on the big 200 and we have no plans whatsoever to mark that special occasion whatsoever. But let's focus on this week's show. Joining me first of all, Alex Battaglia. Hello.
Yeah, it's my first time back since CES and on the show, right? And it feels a bit weird. Everything's a bit new, but I'll get used to it. New year, new me.
Okay. Oliver, how are you?
New year, new me. Back from CS. It was a lot of fun, but I'm excited to tackle the show today and all of its various questions and intrigues.
Absolutely. Okay, so before we move on, as always, please do visit store.digitalfoundry.net to access our merchandising wares. But with that, let's move on to the first discussion point. Okay, so literally as we record this, it's the morning after the night before where Microsoft revealed Developer_Direct 2025, focus on 4 great games. Got to say, still think that Developer Direct is pretty much the best game show that's put out by anyone at this point. It's just fantastic from start to finish. Fantastic games as well. Where should we begin? Alex, let's talk about Doom, The Dark Ages, because obviously we've been looking forward to this one immensely. The more we see of it, the more we love it. And this was pretty fantastic stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and here I really see id Software leveraging the current generation of consoles in a very meaningful way to upgrade the game design of the game, something that we don't typically see. A lot of games in the cross-gen period, ever since the PS5 and Xbox Series X generation started, were actually just kind of game ideas that would flow totally fine on a PS4 or Xbox. Well, Xbox One is debatable sometimes, but at least on a PS4. And and here we see what you can do if you put in that extra CPU horsepower into meaningful gameplay additions into a game. And I think that's readily visible in any of the scenes where they show off some of the larger combat encounters where it looks like dozens upon dozens of Doom enemies. Doom enemies are obviously not just, like caricatures of enemies. They actually do have an AI in them doing something. It's not just a series of animations. And you can see in a lot of scenes that there's just a whole lot more than you would have seen in Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. And from what I recall in like a design session, they did mention back in the day that one of the things that drove Doom 2016's core design of arena-based gameplay rather than I would describe old school Doom as like not arenas usually, but more like you go through levels and there's a persistent AI throughout the entire level and you can enter areas kind of willingly and draw enemies out of them even. Well, with Doom 2016, due to CPU limitations and trying to hit 60 FPS, that wasn't something they could reasonably do. You couldn't corral enemies, dozens of them into a single room and start fighting. But in this game, there's obviously a lot more of that going on along with the larger map design. So I'm really happy to see that. I don't know, Oliver, what do you think?
I thought it looked fantastic. Like you said, you get that larger encounter design, and indeed they seem to indicate that it could be kind of like almost Tomb Raider style, where you have these kind of larger levels with possible little areas that you can go in and explore and things like that. Kind of like what we saw with Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, but just pushed out further in terms of those kind of side areas. In terms of the gameplay, I really like the emphasis on a more grounded style of gameplay. I really like the new Doom games. I must admit, I really love those games, but this works well too. It's kind of more tactile. It's more strafing oriented. It's more grounded. I don't think you have the double dash in Doom.
Right. I don't think that's
Doom
there.
Eternal. I'm not even sure you have the double jump. So it looks pretty locked to the ground. And also they did kind of sort of eliminate glory kills. Basically what happens is when an enemy gets into that low health state, you can kind of go up to them and just hit the shield button or hit the melee button or whatever and take them out. And that probably works a little bit differently, I can imagine, because in the new Doom games, you have some invincibility frames in there, right? Here, I presume that's not the case because you still have camera control. It's not kind of taking over that player perspective, that player camera. That's probably a little bit different. It seems like it's just a single input and then you move on from there. I like glory kills, but this is good too. So I think from a gameplay perspective, this is really awesome. I love the new Doom games, and I'll be playing this a lot for sure, probably on PC though, with ray tracing support, because I think, to my eyes, this looks like maybe console feature set to me, because I guess rendering wise, probably RTGI is my guess here. In part because obviously Indie uses it on consoles, and in part because on PC apparently the game requires RT capable graphics hardware. Indeed, it doesn't even just say like, oh, you know, use an RX 6700 or whatever. They specifically just say RT capable graphics card with 8 gigabytes of VRAM or 16 gigabytes of VRAM, these kinds of delineations there. That'd be very helpful, obviously, for lighting these larger levels, right, in a way that would be realistic and in concordance with their kind of high level of visual fidelity here. In terms of other techniques, though, I think for reflections, it looks a little SSR-y to me. It's hard to say for sure. There are some moments where it looks very SSR-ish in terms of the way the reflections are changing when the player position is changing to me. And the reflections that we do see, obviously, are perpendicular to the camera, so they're kind of aligned in such a way that would make them appropriate for, you know, they have the screen space information there, basically. But there are some moments where, like, I would expect to see some SSR occlusion problems in the corner of the screen where I'm not seeing that. So maybe they have a good fallback there. And I don't think they're using RT shadows or anything like that, because the shadows look very diffuse and kind of amorphous and not like that super precise clinical shadow that you can get near the casting object with RT shadows. I'm not really seeing that necessarily. So yeah, I think like the lighting here looks great. I think the environments look great. I think the gameplay looks great. I mean, I think this is like shaping up to be a really exciting title. But especially on PC where you get that path tracing. Obviously, Alex and I did see the path tracing in person. We can't show you the footage, but we did see the PC version path traced in motion, and it did look quite appealing, I would say, Alex. But yeah, this is definitely still pretty good looking as well.
Yeah, coming back to that ray tracing, though, I'm very happy to see id Tech fully embracing it as part of their base design document. Now, I think what Oliver said makes a lot of sense. If you look at the size of this world, Doom had previously, with its like smaller arena-based level design, they would use light maps extensively. Ever since Doom 2016. Well, even before that, you go back to id Tech 5, those games were basically just a light map. Here, that is really, with the already high-res textures that are there, the potential for possibly more dynamism in how lighting is done, it really just doesn't make any feasible sense to have a ton of lighting data on disk. And instead, like Indiana Jones, they're going to be utilizing it. And I think that is it's just great to finally see some other studios, even ones that are targeting consoles as their base, having their primarily lighting done by ray tracing. And as we saw in Indiana Jones, it looks pretty darn good, especially after like the first patch that they dropped. It looked pretty darn good on Series X in that regard. So I don't really have any qualms with any of that. I'm very excited also to see the path tracing in front of me running on my GPU. Like, we were pretty far away, unfortunately, from the projector. I was like looking at it, I was like, I see reflections that look good. But it did look better than what we saw here in those aspects. But I really would, I can't wait to see this up close. Yeah. And also, Doom is such a fast game. It'd probably be the fastest like camera movement game we have that supports full ray tracing when the time comes, I presume. And that's like a really challenging denoising thing. So I'm very curious to see how that pans out.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, other than that, I'm very excited. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, interesting observations there from you guys. But I was just checking my email, and John actually had a pre-brief with the developer direct stuff. He was going to be here today, but he's not feeling very well. So I forwarded you the details, and it's actually looking hugely exciting and actually validates some of the comments you've just said. Basically, all new dynamic interactive lighting powered by ray tracing, all lighting and shadow fully dynamic. Also, ray-traced material detection for gameplay. So this is kind of like what we've been hoping to see for some years now, which is, basically a really talented developer taking on board the ray tracing feature set and baking it into the engine at the base level. And this is kind of like why the PC system specs are what they are. I mean, the base GPU is similar to Indiana Jones, actually. It's a 2060 Super, which is pretty interesting stuff. It still looks highly performant. I mean, they're still recommending a Zen 2 processor for 1080p 60 on low settings, Zen 3 for recommended. So, it's not as if this is going to come with any sort of onerous performance hit. We're just kind of scaling with how performance on new hardware has basically arrived over time, which I think is fantastic. I mean, there's a lot that's going on here. We're going to be doing a huge deep dive into this, hopefully. But yeah, I mean, a new streaming technology. I mean, we saw that those levels that were in the developer direct were pretty fast, right? It's pretty impressive stuff. Everything's just been ramped up. They also, this is an interesting point, higher fidelity texture detail via multi-layer composite materials. They're looking to lower VRAM consumption while at the same time increasing texture detail. That's an interesting point, bearing in mind the controversy that's kind of raging around Indiana Jones at the moment, where basically the developer is asking you to set the texture pool size manually, when my feeling is it kind of should be set automatically based on the resources of the GPU. Because if not, then suddenly, you've got a GPU that's perfectly capable of running max settings, but because it may only have like 8 or 12 gigs, or in the case of the 2080 Ti, 11 gigs, things don't work properly. So, yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Any thoughts, Alex, based on this new information?
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited. They did... at the presentation where we saw path tracing, they did mention the gameplay aspect of using materials or using ray tracing to check the material of something, like when it's hit in the world, for example, by a stray bullet or a physical thing. And it's really cool to see it confirmed in text. But another thing that I also, in very much so in agreement with you, Rich, that I feel like VRAM for textures really shouldn't be a manual setting in 2024 for most use cases, or 2025, sorry.
The year of our Lord, even.
The year of our Lord, 2025. And I really think the Snowdrop engine has this down, and I do not like the way it is presented necessarily, both in previous IdTech as well as in, I always go back to those Nixie Sports, because those are, you could just absolutely ruin your performance with those settings, and people who don't know a lot about PCs could have their settings ruining their gameplay experience, and then they have to start like searching online as to why, and those things I think actually get in the way of a good UX. So I'm happy to see this, but I'm also very happy to see an emphasis on ultra fast proprietary continuous sector streaming level technology, because I have been Mr. Anti-traversal stutter and anti-shader compilation stutter. We don't have to worry about shader compilation at all with IdTech, but with traversal stutter, that could affect even games with perfect, pre-compilation of shaders. And we see that time and time again. So I'm pretty sure this is probably going to be one of the games with the best frame time possibly ever for its feature set. So, that's what I like to see. I like to see flat, fast, fluid, real-time lighting. Those are all these are just keywords that are making my brain go, the dopamine is coming out. So
I also love how they're just talking about more AI, more geometry, more gore, more destruction. And indeed, when you watch the trailer, when you watch what they put together there, the enemies all sustain chip damage, pieces of them are coming off.
That's
and
cool.
That's something they introduced in Eternal, but here it actually looked even a little bit bigger and maybe a little bit more granular in terms of the details that came together. And one thing I also thought was sort of interesting is I'm just looking at the footage that we can't show you right now of the PC ray tracing footage, and one thing that really does stand out there is the shadows are very crisp and very sharp and very nicely defined. So that's I think maybe one of the bigger advantages you're going to see on PC with the path tracing relative to console is that kind of shadow map imprecision that you're getting on consoles is going to probably be alleviated on a high-end PC with a good graphics card there running the path tracing mode. I think that should be really exciting. So here, I'm just super excited to see what they do with it. I think this is going to be one of the standout games of the year, if not the standout game of the year, at least judging from this list. It certainly seems incredibly impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just referring back to these announced PC specifications, and the CPU side is actually very, very light. They're basically recommending Ryzen 7 5700X for the recommended and indeed the ultra settings. I'm assuming though that obviously the more CPU horsepower you have, 5700X is relatively modest these days. The more CPU horsepower you have, the more your potential base, the higher your potential base frame rate can be. It's basically going to be the question of being GPU bound or CPU bound, similar to Doom Eternal, actually, where, you know, we saw those great demos where it's like running at 300 frames per second, CPU limited in some scenarios. That was kind of nuts. The GPU side, the recommendation for 1440p 60 is a 3080 or a 6800, AMD RX 6800. So, you know, we're seeing sort of recommended specs creeping up into, you know, older 80 class GPUs essentially. And then, you know, Ultra is 4080 or better, and 7900 XT. I mean, we're moving into pretty extreme territory there. But that's kind of what I want to see. There's this interesting thing where, you know, going back to CES, there was this bizarre story where it's like Black Myth Wukong only runs at 27 frames per second on a 5090. It's like, yes, and that's actually a good thing, because basically what they've done is created a game that runs well on the hardware of today, which isn't mentioned in the headline for some reason, but will scale well into the hardware of the future, which is kind of what we want from a PC port. You want that scalability across the whole range. I mean, you can run Wukong on, like, actually, you know, very low PC requirements. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be a great experience, but the point is it scales. And you kind of want that. I mean, going back to the path tracing stuff, which you've seen that I haven't, because I missed CES, unfortunately. But obviously, I'm assuming that this was being powered by DLSS4 multi-frame generation. We're going to talk about that in much more depth in further on in the show, because it's certainly shaking up the discourse, so to speak. I'm just curious as to how good a fit that is going to be for a fast first-person shooter game like Doom. I mean, we're talking about actually the denoising potentially being an issue. Because typically there's kind of like a lag to it, which you'd think wouldn't be compatible with a first-person, almost like a Twitch shooter game. It's not quite a Twitch shooter, but you know what I mean. But obviously it must, you know, they've baked it in at the engine level. They must know what they're doing here. So very curious to see how all of that's going to pan out. Let's move on to the next game that we wanted to highlight. And this was kind of like a surprise out of the blue for the developer _direct, which was a brand new Ninja Gaiden game. And basically this fantastic collaboration between Microsoft handling the publishing duties, although it is multi-platform, we should stress that, and Platinum Games and Team Ninja. Oliver, thoughts on this?
Oh, I thought it looked very good and very platinum indeed before they revealed it was platinum in the trailer. I kind of thought, oh, this looks very platinum to me. Some of the sequences in here look quite reminiscent of Astral Chain, I would say, that 2018 Switch game. Not just in terms of the gameplay, like there's some sequences in here, like the rail grinding sequences that remind me a little bit of Astral Chain, but also in terms of that neon aesthetic and the particle effects. And I don't know, maybe I could get some input from Alex, but I kind of wonder if this is maybe not the typical UE and it might be some in-house tech from Platinum or something like that. That definitely seems plausible to me, very possible to me. In particular, it does not look like the Ninja Gaiden 2 black version here, which looks like UE5. I mean, it is UE5 and it looks like UE5 to a large degree. Here, it looks much more platinum-y, and I kind of, again, I'm just reminded, the shader work, everything here kind of reminds me a little bit of Astral Chain, although more realistic than Astral Chain. Does make me think it could be that tech, but I don't know what you think there, Alex.
I was thinking the exact same thing, and there were some question marks in there still. I think, like for example, if it were UE5, we would see a very different indirect lighting situation, even though this was mostly at taking place at night in like neon, escapes. You could still see like legacy SSAO and just kind of like unplaced lighting characteristics of things, like just like, where's this light coming from? And that, to me, that's fine though, because they're targeting 60 FPS on modest hardware, like most Platinum games do, and that's all fine actually. But there were some of the question marks for me where there's a number of points in the trailer, like I think there's one where like they're the main character, whose name escapes me, is sliding down like rain slicked kind of like breaking bridge or something like that, or like a decline, and you can see like on this decline there's reflections of some distant lighting features,
right.
And they kind of have like a laggy TAA look to them, which is reminiscent of what you would see typically less with SSR but more with RT reflections. And that was a little bit of a question mark for me, because Platinum really hasn't gone into higher rendering features in a lot of their games. Mm-hmm. And that would be a first, I think, as far as I know, or at least as far as I can recollect. And I thought that all looked pretty great. I mean, when you did do the back-to-back in terms of visual feature set with Ninja Gaiden, or Gaiden, however you want to pronounce it, 2 Black, I thought the remake of the old game did look visually like, I was like, oh, I love the UE5 feature set in these aspects. So I think the remake did look visually better, but performance is going to be a whole other question, of course, as well as image quality. So I think this looked good, and I was really happy to see this series revive, and I'm happy to see Platinum working on stuff. It seems like they've kind of had issues lately. Right. Also, Team Ninja in general, I don't think they don't miss a lot. They're actually pretty competent, so this should be great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's also great to see Platinum working with Microsoft again after the Scalebound cancellation. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to say about this. I'm not a huge fan of the series, but I do appreciate that many people love it, and it's great to see it back. And in terms of what I am seeing in the trailer, it's just like classic Platinum / Ninja Gaiden, etc. So I'm quite happy about this. I'm not really too worried. It's similar to Stellar Blade, right, where people kind of misconstrued our comments by saying that it wasn't, pushing the state of the art in technology. It didn't have to. It had great design and it was super performant. That's kind of fine. That's absolutely fine. And I'm seeing a similar thing here. So yeah, looking forward to this. The remaster that they quote unquote shadow dropped. I do love that that sort of that phrase there. It's kind of bizarre, but
shadow drop.
That's some sort of MI5 Black Op.
It is. Yeah.
But we had some questions as to whether we're going to be looking at that, and John basically DM'd me on Slack last night saying I've got to look at this. So it's going to happen. So yes, Xbox, PlayStation 5, PC. Some complaints about the Game Pass version not having DLSS. I'm not sure whether that's common to the Steam version, but apparently not. And yeah, obviously there's going to be PlayStation 5 Pro, Xbox, etc. So do look forward to that. Let's move on to the next game that we saw in Developer_Direct 2025, Clair Obscur Expedition 33, which, we kind of enjoy seeing developers arrive with something that looks completely different to anything we've seen before in the past. We've got the sort of JRPG vibes to it, but the execution, the presentation just looked absolutely fantastic, I thought. And it was great to get a view of their sort of studio ethos during the segment there. Alex, thoughts on this one?
Yeah, this was, I've already seen Doom the Dark Ages at that preview thing. And so this for me has been probably the most exciting thing I saw on the Direct, just because I don't see a lot of developers, pushing for non-real-time combat in large games. Usually that's why Baldur's Gate was actually, for me, a breath of fresh air. I really like non-real-time combat in games. And so I really like that. But I also, presentation I think was top-notch, minus some performance stuff that Oliver might want to touch on. But I want to say that it's interesting how I think like the whole JRPG-ness of this is put through like a different lens from a different developer from a different part of the world. And it's leading to some very unique designs. When they were like introducing all the characters, I was actually kind of interested in what this world was going to be saying and doing and all the weirdness of it, because it didn't look like some sort of straightforward storyline or straightforward, typical plot. It looked really odd, and I didn't know what things were. So I was actually invested in like in my brain while watching this trailer and developer direct. I was like trying to investigate it in my brain, like say like, okay, what is this object? What is this thing? What is this? What do these people actually do? And that's pretty rare for me when I watch game trailers, because they're usually overly straightforward. And so I was actually curious the entire time. And I definitely want to cover this one when it comes out. I think they mentioned it's this year release. I cannot remember.
It is, yeah. I mean, that was kind
release
of
date
like one of the big points of this particular presentation. Everything is happening this year. They've got a fantastic slate, Microsoft. There's just no doubt about it. It's really sort of coming together for them now. Yeah. Oliver, what do you think?
Yeah, it's April 24th of this year, so coming up pretty quick.
My goodness.
Along with Doom in May, so that's a pretty exciting slate, especially the first half of the year. Quite a few titles here, as well as South of Midnight, which we'll talk about in a moment. But yeah, in terms of the design, I mean, the game that obviously came to my mind is Persona a little bit, just because of the combat and the UI and the story, which kind of seems like you have this cast of characters who have their own little narratives with each other, as well as this broader overarching story, and then the use of non-human characters, and it kind of seemed like that, albeit much more French than Persona. Definitely different cultural influence for sure, which I think Alex was alluding to a little bit. I think it looks very, very pretty here. It is UE5. Characters, materials, spells, everything looks great. I mean, I don't know what to say. It looks quite UE5-ish, but it also looks, I think, very, very beautiful here. The only exception to that would be some pretty hard frame rate drops in certain moments, especially with spells. Looks a little bit unstable at this early stage. I would guess the target would be 30 FPS on consoles, but there's a mix of footage here, because some of it is like 60 FPS-ish with drops. Some of it is like 30 FPS-ish with drops. It's kind of a bit of a variable frame rate range there. So I hope they haven't pushed UE5 too hard for consoles here, or for PC also, obviously, because it does seem like a game that's not that far away, and the performance level is not 100% where I'd like it to be. But at the same time, it is a turn-based game, so if they just get it to like a reasonably stable 30 FPS, I think that's probably okay. For a game that looks this good, I think that's probably all right. So yeah, just something to look out for here. A lot of the games here had like a little bit of a not perfect performance level. This is also the case with Ninja Gaiden 4 and a number of other titles. Yeah. South of Midnight had some issues as well. So I wouldn't expect this necessarily to be like final production polish, obviously, but just something to note for now.
Yeah, I just like the segment that they had on the show there, which was, essentially showing the individuality and the independent nature of the studio, and it's reflected in the game. But the game itself definitely seems to have like, full-on AAA production values to it. It's quite remarkable to see that 4 years of hard work coming together there. So really looking forward to seeing the end product, which is not so far away. Let's move on to the final game in our roundup, which is South of Midnight. This is an interesting one. Very stylized, very sort of specific to the developer. Oliver, thoughts?
Yeah, I'm sort of split on this. I think it looks great in some respects. Like I do like the decimated animation style to some degree. Obviously, we've seen that work in some other titles like Hi-Fi Rush. A little bit of a different style there, but I think it does work well in some games. It's got this kind of graphic painted look to it, which I think is pretty cool. But the more I kind of think about it, and the more I kind of scroll through this footage, I do have some slight concerns. Like, there's a bit of a visual discordance, even at 60 hertz here, with the way that some of the characters are moving their bodies and their, like, facial animations, which are at a lower rate there. Things like that. They also mix the update rate for, like, the character animation and, like, animation for things like the cloth, the cape that might be belonging behind them, things like that, during gameplay, which I thought, to me, initially it looks a little bit jarring, but maybe it looks better as you go along. But I kind of do wonder a little bit about this, and I raised this before the call, is like, how does this look at high frame rates on PC? Right. Does that really hold up well? Because at 60 hertz on console, it might look all right, but when you've got like MFG up to 480 hertz on PC, is that really an amazing experience, or does it look like all of a sudden it look very visually discordant and not 100% there? I think the gameplay here looks cool. I think the visual design is cool. I think what they're doing here is interesting here. I think this looks like a very distinctive game, but I do just wonder about how some of those visual elements look in the final version, and especially how they would scale to like super high refresh rates and update rates on something like a 5090 or something like that, if that would be ideal necessarily. That's my only concern, really.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Alex?
Yeah, I've got very similar concerns. So I like Oliver. I also do love the painterly aspect to the world. I do like the focus on the region where it takes place in. Also, just weird kind of, I don't know. It's you don't usually see characters like this as well as this part of the world in video games. So it's good to see that new perspective. And I think the studio, I really like the people they put forward to talk about it in the video as well too. But the decimated animation thing is like most of the time in pretty much all games, I have just not liked it. I think it's because my eyes, when they see the way the camera advances versus the way the rest of the world moves, I just view it as like an artifact and I don't view it as stylization. Because I feel like we're in an interactive medium and the higher the frame rate, the better always in that aspect. So like, I'm really cool. I'm like really keen on low persistence. I'm really keen on smoothness, including motion blur in that aspect as well there too. And having this mix of frame rates, and I really couldn't get down exactly what the frame rate was because for different objects, it seemed different almost. I swear in a couple of cutscenes, it looked like 12 almost for like the character movement. But then in gameplay, some stuff obviously wasn't 12. Maybe it was like 30.
Yeah.
Or 20.
I think during gameplay, it was often 60 FPS, like in terms of the way that game was actually running. But a lot of those animations are like on 2s or 3s. So like 30 FPS or 20 FPS, something like that. Yeah, it seemed like a mixing almost, depending upon what was happening. And for me, it just really bothers my eyes. So I know that's what they're going for. This has become more popular as of late due to a lot of, I would say, tentpole animation titles embracing it. But I'm not super keen on it. I wish it was an option, like turn on, turn off animation decimation. Mm-hmm. And I think it would make me happy. It would make me happy.
I think the point is that if it is a specific part of the developer's vision, that's fair enough. The question is really then, what frame rate is it actually designed for? And how does the decimation work when a PC user wants to run it at 120, 240 hertz? How does that work? Does it actually still preserve the developer vision if the PC user is doing that? Big questions there and no answers really at the moment. So I'm looking forward to seeing it. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so this week saw the review embargo lift on the RTX 5090, which was a very interesting launch. The new GPU is astonishingly fast, but it's also astonishingly expensive at 2,000 of your USD dollars. And we were typically seeing anything from like a 22% to a 38% increase over RTX 4090. And there's a number of things that are interesting about this. First of all, it's on the same process node as the 4090 effectively. So they weren't able to benefit from all of the advantages of a new process node. Clocks are actually slower than the 4090. Power consumption is very high indeed. There's a lot going on there, and not the kind of gains that people possibly were expecting after the stratospheric increases offered by the 4090. Now, I personally think that that stuff that 4090 was doing was, it's the exception, not the rule. Generally. And we're also coming off the back of Ampere, which again offered huge gen-on-gen gains. So possibly we've been spoiled there. But anyway, Alex, where do we want to start on here? Because there's a lot to talk about here with the 5090.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we should maybe talk first about what you were talking about. It's on the same process node. It is offering it is increasing the performance over the 4090, but it isn't doing it in a way like we have seen in the past. Here, there's more shader cores. There is more VRAM bandwidth by quite a big deal.
It's
actually,
gigantic. It's like 77% improvement over 4090. It's nuts.
It's nuts, and I guess the 5080 is going to even be bigger in that regard. But it's using the fastest version of the memory. But here, when you look at the numbers in the game, you had some great across 17 titles, I believe it was, as well as I watched the Gamers Nexus review. They had a lot of titles as well too. And they, there's these ranges there. And sometimes it hits big. And sometimes it doesn't hit as big over the 4090. And when you go down to look at power draw at high resolution, for example, like 4K, and you look at how much performance you're getting for the power drawn over the 4090 in a similar situation, yes, you're getting more performance, but you are also spending a lot more power to get there.
Yeah.
And it's almost like 1-to-1 with the 4090 in that aspect. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think that's an interesting thing, because they are on the same process node, but in the presentations that we saw at CES, NVIDIA did present specific things about power savings through a different like logic and hardware and software of turning down the GPU to different lower states to essentially get more power, or reduce power for the performance you're getting. And they also showed off a change to the SM, and there it was kind of focusing on the fact that now we're going to do integer 32 math at the same time, like dual pumping it essentially, just like they did with FP32 math, starting with the Ampere line of GPUs. And if you look at the overall average there across all these titles, it really does paint the picture that these things that they talked about at CES, as of currently right now, are not leading to dramatic increases in efficiency, even on the same process node. And this is, it's different. You don't really, I would have expected more almost, actually, as a result. And I feel like the efficiency isn't as great as I would love to have it been for the GPUs that we're getting right now. I really wish, like, even on the same process node, NVIDIA's done it in the past before, where they managed to eke out better power and performance versus the previous generation of GPUs on the same node. What was the most famous one, Rich? Was it Pascal?
Maxwell was on the same node as Kepler, and obviously the GTX 970, 980, 980 Ti, those are like GPUs of legend. And they were running on the same node as Kepler, which was great for its time, but there were huge boosts there. I'm just wondering, there's an ongoing discussion about the how far we can take standard rasterization techniques, and to the extent as to whether they're going to actually produce these big performance bumps. I mean, there was actually a big question mark over how NVIDIA actually did it with Maxwell. I think in the end there was some sort of analysis which said they moved to some sort of variation of tile-based deferred rendering, similar to Power VR. And, that's kind of like a revelatory change in how you would process a 3D image, which, it's done. It's part of the architecture now. Where do you go from there? Maybe it's the case that there's only iterative improvements. Maybe it's the case that the games actually have to be developed to tap into those features. You don't get an automatic huge performance boost, so to speak. Yeah, I get what you're saying there, because there is a lot of improvements made. But at the same time, we are looking at scaling, which does kind of suggest, like a 4090 Ti or a 40 class Titan product, a step beyond, as opposed to like this generational leap through architectural improvements. It's just not seemingly happening.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we may end up seeing that though down the line for other workloads. The whole neural rendering thing I think is fascinating. I think it is the future of rendering, and they did tout changes to Blackwell specifically that will aid that greatly when the time comes. But right now, those things are, music of the future, as I would call them. They're like something like you can't really enjoy right now. So we don't see any of that. It's
highly reminiscent of Turing, right? I mean, it was actually really interesting when I included the 2080 Ti in the review, because that's a 2018 GPU. It wasn't really maligned in the same way that the 2080 was, but there was a lot of question marks over why NVIDIA has taken this new direction, because we're not actually seeing any gains from it. The 2080 has actually VRAM apart matured into a really good GPU that's still doing pretty decent stuff even today. And I was really sort of heartened to see that even when we're sort of battering it with native resolution rendering and stupidly high settings, it seemed to be the VRAM that was letting it down the most. But, use DLSS, use optimized settings. In fact, I might do a video on it at some point, because the 2080 Ti is kind of like the... everybody likes to talk about fine wine in the GPU space. There's this sort of romantic notion that maybe you don't need to upgrade. Maybe, there was some sort of forward-looking design that's still great to this day. And I'd say that if there is one candidate for that, it probably is the 2080 Ti.
I'd agree with that, yeah.
Interesting stuff. Let's take some supporter questions on this, because we had a ton of them surrounding the 5090 reviews and the various sort of associated technologies that were discussed. Let's start with this one from Perfect_Organism. Not sure how embargoes look on this. They're fine, don't worry. But any whisperings... any whispers on the underground grapevine, Alex, on how ultra performance targeting 4K looks on DLSS 4? So this is talking about the transformer model improvements to DLSS, which, it's not under embargo, because actually, presumably after Perfect_Organism wrote the question, Cyberpunk was updated and everybody can access the transformer model now, to the point where people are actually... hacking the new transformer model into other games, going all the way back to like Shadow of the Tomb Raider and stuff like that, which is like excellent. But yeah, I mean, basically there's been a lot of discussion about, okay, so performance mode now looks as good as like quality mode or whatever, I don't know. But this is an interesting question, right? How does ultra performance targeting 4K look? Any initial thoughts on that?
Initial thoughts are that it looks better than it did before. With ray reconstruction, I would say dramatically better in a lot of ways. Now, ultra performance also is a good. So, like if you look at the differentiation in internal resolution, at least axis resolution, the difference between like the 66 to 67% axis res down to 50% there. On the performance mode, that's it's a good chunk. But then when you go down to ultra performance mode, it is another like very large chunk. I almost feel like NVIDIA could do with a mode in between ultra performance and performance mode, like a 900p mode. I almost feel like would be sweet. Like it'd be
this
really
is
good.
The biased mode in Avatar. They actually took a look at what they considered, I don't know whether it was objectively or subjectively done. They looked at performance mode at 4K, which would be like 1080p scaling. And then they basically came up with their own iterations of the DLSS modes, which they thought encompassed the same sort of quality level at lower resolutions. And I'm not quite sure where the resolutions sit with the biased mode, but it's definitely higher. It's this sort of in-between point that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I'd prefer that almost, but this is more politics than it is. You could actually adjust those things if you actually wanted to, if you cared, with like DLSS tweaks, whatever. But I would say the performance mode, I've really spent most of my time with ray reconstruction this week, because this is a really large topic. I did do some SR stuff, that is super resolution tests, but I kind of, ever since they released the patch for Cyberpunk there, and I've seen the way people have been modding it, I had a limited grouping of titles to originally work with that actually were whitelisted. And I would prefer to use other titles than the whitelisted titles. So I'm going to be kind of releasing a video now about ray reconstruction primarily, and the next video is going to be about super resolution. And but I would say it does look dramatically better, and it is bringing something like a performance mode up to something like, I would say, in between like a balanced and a quality mode. But for some aspects of the video, of the video quality there, like in regards to things that could potentially ghost, it is better than the previous quality mode or even DLAA in that aspect, because it is actually just doing it, like at its base better. Yeah. If there's no ghosting, it's better than ghosting, but at a higher res, right? So that's kind of how I see it right now. I need to get the lineups better to actually like say, and this is going to be per title, it could be different in one title versus the next. So, but the Transformer model so far, and I've seen a lot of user impressions. Obviously, some of those are, people just loading up and doing ABs with their own eyes. But a lot of people have also appreciated that it is like a perfection of with the goals of DLSS. And my initial impressions are in agreement with that for a lot of things, I would say.
Okay, cool. This question from Salman. Hello, DF crew. If you use your 1 week time machine, would you say the RTX 5090 is the GPU to get for a 4K 240 hertz life? I'll ask you that one, Oliver, except to say that, well, if you've got the fastest GPU that money can buy, then you probably... Yes, that's sort of like an actual answer to that one. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when we were looking at it at CES, it seemed quite a transformative technology. And yeah, most of the games that we saw at CES were demoed on 240 hertz displays, and they did all seem like they were hitting their performance targets quite effectively in a way that the 4090 could not really achieve. For me, I have a 170 hertz monitor, so the 4090 does a reasonable job with frame generation, especially of addressing that refresh rate. But in terms of my own actual 5090, I have not had time to experiment with it too much yet, in part because I'm working on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth PC, and I'm mostly testing with my 4090 there, because it seemed a little bit excessive to show people performance
Yes.
numbers with a card they can't even have yet. So mostly I've not been using it too much, but I mean, it's a beautiful card. The performance seems really, really solid, obviously, and I think it should do a really superb job of addressing not only 4K 240 hertz displays, but also like 1440p 480 hertz displays. I think some of those are floating out around there. I'd really kind of look at this as like the solution for ultra high refresh rates into the stratosphere. Blurbusters would approve, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, NVIDIA did allow us to play a series of games with DLSS 4 MFG, only 6 or actually less than that even, but it is kind of nuts to be seeing RT Overdrive running, in excess of 240 hertz at 4K. It's quite staggering to see, but there's a lot of pushback against what we're actually seeing as to whether this is a step forward or not. In actual fact, let's take a look at this question from SG33 in brackets Jake. Hi Jake.
Hi Jake.
Let's get that out of the way. Hi all. I think frame generation is an excellent technology, but the big flaw to me is that it only works as a multiplier, 2x, 3x, 4x, etc. I'd argue that most people aren't looking to double or treble their frame rate, but instead bring their frame rate up to match their refresh rate. So somebody using frame gen to get their 110 FPS game up to 144 FPS would have to go down to a lower native frame rate when using frame generation. It's a big flaw in the technology. What methods could be taken to use frame gen to simply match a user's refresh rate and essentially make VRR unnecessary? That is an extremely tricky question, right, Alex? Because the whole basis of frame generation is based on the idea of buffering a frame, right? So how would you deploy? You'd have to basically decide how many frames to deploy and when. I can only see that adding to latency.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
it's a baffling one.
With interpolation, at least, interpolating the middle frame there, the only way to do it would be kind of a logic to say how many frames need to be buffered up and how many in between frames do we get to make sure we get to refresh rate. But you don't want to actually be at refresh rate. You want to be at, like, what is it, like 3% less than refresh rate,
right?
Due to reflex.
Yeah.
And in that case, I don't think that is
tricky.
It's doable, but it would be in the moments when frame rate, like, not all games run always at 110 FPS on a 144 hertz monitor, right? They have sections that run at like 70 FPS or 80 FPS. Not every game is like where they're checking like the frame time per scene and making sure it's almost relatively flat in every scene. A lot of games have very variable frame rate. And in that aspect, a combinatorial thing would actually be a whole system designed around keeping essentially resolution fluid, and less so the amount of frames generated fluid. I would almost say like that's probably the most reasonable way to do it with an interpolation setup. The real way to do this would be combining interpolation with extrapolation. So you would have an understanding of how much the next frame is going to cost based upon some parameter. And then you would actually extrapolate a certain percentage of the frame to make sure that it keeps within the frame time budget. Then maybe interpolate up, that's how you probably do it.
I mean, potentially you could actually run the CPU part of the next frame, and then rather than send it to the GPU renderer, you send it to the neural network to come up with the next frame. But I'm sure that would have been trialed and tested by NVIDIA, and I'm sure that the not so much the latency, but the artifacts probably would have been extreme. It's a super tricky one for sure. And yes, I mean, it's interesting that they haven't just gone straight to 4x MFG. And the reason why is that, let's say, I mean, I've got 120 hertz 48-inch OLED, as you do, Alex, right? 4x MFG is going to be way, 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 way too high. In fact, even 3x with the 5090. But the point is that you should be dialing down the multiplier to be as close to your to your refresh rate as possible. Really, that's kind of weird, but that's kind of the way it is. Increasing the setting isn't always guaranteeing a better experience, and equally, it could be the case that actually the 5080 or a less capable GPU may be a better fit for your screen in that case. Although, again, possibly not.
Yeah. You can almost think about it as like super sampling in that aspect. Like you could, in old GPUs, you could run 2x super sampling or 4x or 8x, but you wouldn't want to do that because it would introduce another artifact, like a temporal artifact. You'd be running at a lower frame rate. But this time you have to think about it as the other way around. Like we are increasing the super sampling on the temporal dimension, but affecting other aspects of the pipeline, our input latency as well as image quality. Yep. So, it's like a different type of trade-off.
Yeah. Let's talk about frame generation in general, because, man, this is all sort of coming to the fore now, and it all came about because of NVIDIA basically saying, hey, the 5070 has the performance of a 4090, where, mathematically the 5080 won't have the performance of a 4090. So the concept of using multi-frame generation to say, hey, this is as good, our $550 product is as good as last gen 1600. There was a huge amount of discourse about this, and, it is based on the concept of frame generation. Here are my issues, right? I mean, testing the 5080 Cyberpunk, you're getting a base frame rate that's pretty high.
5090, by the way.
5090, yes.
Right?
Yes,
yeah,
quite right. 5090, you're getting a base frame rate that's so high that the base input lag is actually quite low, like sub 30 milliseconds. So I can't really tell the difference between input lag that's like, mid-20s in the millisecond range to mid-30s. So in this case, frame generation is almost like a net win because the experience feels the same, but it looks a lot smoother. And if you've got a 480 hertz screen, a 240 hertz screen, to see path tracing running with that level of fluidity, looking that great, it's just fantastic. My concern kicks in when you start moving to the lower end parts, because the base frame rate is going to be lower, therefore the latency will be higher, and then you're going to reach a threshold point, I feel, where the additional overhead of frame generation, which will be higher on lower end parts because they're less performant, right? Suddenly it does start to become noticeable. So, I think that's probably going to be the whole basis of the 5070 review. It's basically, does this claim hold up? And I've got to say, we've got to talk about reviews in general, but let's talk about frame generation for now. What do you think about this concept of calling generated frames performance? It's kind of, in the review I called it quasi performance because with the 5090 specifically, it does feel good, it does look good, it works. You could put probably a bunch of people into a double blind taste test and they probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So in that case, it's a win. But based on the data, based on, pixel peeping or whatever. It isn't. It's kind of bizarre, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, if I'll take this one up, I feel like, we need to get past our old, let's get past our old conceits about what is actually realistic given the current status of technology. And the past was a very different one where we could see these things due to process nodes shrinking all the time. Now we're not there anymore. So we need to find new avenues to increase our enjoyment of a game's fluidity. And I feel like frame generation is one really strong avenue to do that. And as a result, we need to also come into that with a different mindset. We should at the forefront of it, always have these brackets that say, but this is not the same as a natively generated frame, but it can be good enough to fool you. And that is the most important part, because perception is all about graphics, right? Video games, nothing about a video game's graphics is real. There are no real frames, and I thought Brian Cantazaro was saying that back in the day. It made me laugh, and it was very true. There are so many shortcuts that are already in there before you even start thinking about generating a frame, that it is, I think, phenomenologically, for most people, they would not even notice it until we get to these thresholds like you talked about, Rich, where I think the base frame rate is very important. And I think that is your defining experience there. But MFG, I think, is actually much more powerful than the original frame gen.
Yeah.
Where with the original frame gen and its cost and its opportunity cost, where it wasn't just doubling GPU limited frame rates always, it really wasn't. You were thinking should I do 70 to 80 FPS or 120-ish with frame gen? And that was the cost you would have to think. Do I want a native experience or do I want a frame gen experience? And they had different opportunity costs there. But with MFG, the multiplicative enhancer of the frame gen itself is outweighs, at least on the 5090, the native experience pretty much the entire time if you have a set that can handle it. Something above, like Rich said, I think 165 hertz and above, right?
Yeah,
I think that's when it starts becoming better.
Yeah, a couple of years back when the 4090 appeared, I borrowed a Samsung 4K 240 hertz. I think it's the Odyssey Neo G8. And basically, I couldn't really tell the difference above 165 hertz because you could set the various refresh rate levels on the monitor. And you'd only really noticed when you lurched down from 240 to 160, and you could tell the difference because suddenly it was varying wildly. In terms of consistent performance, it was very difficult for me to tell the difference there.
True.
But its perception is a weird thing. I mean, there's going to be people out there who will feel that 10 milliseconds. I've got no doubt about it. The thing that slightly concerns me about talking about frame generation as a performance boost is that a real performance boost from a much faster GPU has no downsides. It's just better across the board. It's the same task being executed more quickly. But at the same time, we've got to realize that, the cost of silicon is such that there is going to be this rebalancing between hardware improvements and improvements brought about via software, which may have some sort of trade that needs to be made. This is really tricky. If I'd had the time, and here's the thing, right? We get a GPU, we have a week to get a review out, right? And that's a week of 7 days, which would include working the weekend. It's not really great. So reviews are always compromised to a certain extent, unless you've got multiple people with multiple units working simultaneously on the same product, which is a luxury, to be honest, to do one review. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of follow-up coverage to this, but I would love to have actually ran Cyberpunk at the same frame rates without multi-frame rate generation to see how low the input lag actually goes. But when you're in the 20s, the difference is going to be really difficult to tell. That's kind of my thoughts on this. Oliver, where do you sit on this debate?
I think my own personal interest in the way that I personally configure games is to get a more or less locked refresh rate. That's what I tend to like. I tend to be really bothered by differences in like when you're moving in particular like a thumbstick around, because I'm usually playing with controllers, and you get that like subtle difference in travel between frames. I just hate that. So I really want to eliminate that as much as possible. Obviously I'm still using VRR, but like if I can get to 144 hertz or 170 hertz minus 4 frames or whatever to accommodate reflex, that's where I want to be. Now, if I need frame gen to get there, I don't mind as long as the base frame rate is like 70, 80 FPS plus. I think it's fine at those 2 refresh rates to use like a one inserted frame gen. I think that works well. If I can't get there, I would rather use a lower refresh rate than have a strongly varying frame rate, in my opinion. But I definitely like to use frame gen before I get to that point. So like I was playing Space Marine 2. Marine 2 is very CPU intensive. I used frame gen to get to like 165 hertz, and that was a really good experience. There are lots of titles where like they're just so demanding in terms of the path tracing that you also just need frame gen to get to like any kind of really reasonable, good feeling refresh. In a title like Star Wars Outlaws, for instance, as well. So like that's typically where I land. The input latency, to me, I think people kind of conceptually need to understand, like going from 30 FPS to 60 FPS, 70 FPS, whatever, you're like halving the input latency. You should be roughly halving the input latency. And then from there onwards, you've got a pretty small pool of input latency relative to what you had before to deal with. So like it's not actually that big of a deal if you're at 80 FPS internally instead of like 120 FPS internally. Obviously, it could get better. I'm sure it will get better in the future. I'd love to see like Reflex 2, for instance, working with frame generation at some point. But, as far as that goes, I think like if you're in that 80 FPS range, 70 FPS range with most games, you should be okay. Maybe if you're a super Twitch competitive player playing Counter-Strike 2 or whatever on a keyboard and mouse, maybe that's not true, but also you shouldn't be using frame gen anyways for a lot of those Twitch games, right? Probably you shouldn't be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to talk about reviews in general now, because we're moving into the age where most people are using features like DLSS, for example, that are not typically covered in depth in reviews, certainly not in ours. They are in others to kind of show the performance increases. However, we've got this really weird situation now where NVIDIA is so far ahead on features that it's almost like we're holding back what we're testing simply because we want to be able to provide an apples to apples comparison, and yet the real world experience is something quite different. There was an interesting comment put forward by one of our supporters saying, well, surely if you're going to be comparing to prior NVIDIA cards, you should be using the new Transformer model because, it's offering better quality, which would actually open up further gaps in sort of performance differentials, because the Transformer model runs best on Blackwell. It's really difficult because, NVIDIA is basically saying, and, I don't have any reason to doubt them, that, between 80 to like 95% of users are using DLSS in any given game. This is like nutty statistics. And yet what's happening with AMD GPUs? We don't know, because AMD hasn't released any numbers as far as I'm aware. Are they using FSR? How do we compare them anyway if the quality visual output is quite different? I'm going to do something a bit more experimental with the 5080 review, I think, because we've got the situation now where we can generate data on an almost industrial scale with our auto benchmarking system. And it is basically... I was actually speaking to a data scientist who is a supporter, and he looked over some of the numbers that we generated for the 5090 review, and he said I could produce an AI model that would give you the same data with 30% of the actual inputs. And if you think about
hilarious.
And if you think about it, you probably only need to benchmark like 30% of the games to get an idea of what the actual meaningful difference is in terms of base performance differentials there. So, with 5090, it's maybe I should be exploring some of this other stuff, because I'm suspecting, based on the numbers brought up by the 5090, that it's probably going to be as you put it, Alex, actually, in the NVIDIA Direct Special you did, that it's more like a super refresh, a super refresh, as opposed to a generational leap as we kind of come to know it. And maybe we should be looking more at the features to say, well, I've got this 5080 here. What am I going to do with it? Because what you're not going to do with it is run it at native resolution against the GPU you had in the past and say, oh, great, this is whatever percent better. Let's crack on. It's not the way it works, really, is it? Where do you stand on this whole reviewing stuff?
I really do want. I mean, everyone can find their niche and look at any review they want. But for me, when I think about how people are using GPUs, they are not doing what you just described. Rather, they are engaging things like DLSS, and they're also looking for transformative experiences. So when people do like the generational divide upgrade, like I had you see people saying like I had a 2080 and I got a 4080 or something like that. They're getting the GPU advantage there, which is going to be obvious, but it's also unlocking the ability to let them play a title that uses the full ray tracing feature set or even more, right? And that is the kind of thing that I think is maybe more interesting, seeing like what kind of new experiences can be unlocked with that and what kind of new little tricks you can do as a result of that GPU power upgrade. For example, like with MFG, can you now do something that you really possibly couldn't have done on a GPU that is more potentially a real upgrade path, like a 3080 or something like that? It's like these like actual real user case upgrade paths as well as real user case experiences, and then see whether or not people actually find that convincing, because the bar charts, they give you an idea on like a theoretical level about what's happening in the GPU maybe, but they don't speak much to user experience anymore. So we have to somehow accommodate that differently in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it is the case now where you could probably sum up a GPU's performance characteristics up against its last gen counterpart in like a paragraph.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, is this compelling content to tell you the same thing for the next 25 minutes? And the answer is probably no. In the case of the 5090, it is a performance play. It is the fastest GPU money can buy. But even then, we're getting a lot of really interesting questions from supporters saying, yeah, but what if? And then, it's stuff that you kind of would have had time to test if, we'd had more than 6 days to review it, including weekends. Yeah. Any thoughts, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I watched a number of reviews while I was working earlier today. I watched a number of reviews on the 5090, and I skipped over the performance figures in every single one because that was the least interesting part of the video to me. And like, I saw a lot of reviews out there with a lot of emphasis on the performance numbers. In some of the reviews, it was like 80 or 90% just bar chart after bar chart after bar chart. I don't really think that informs you much about the card. I'm much more interested in like the software that surrounds the card. Obviously now we have MFG. Is MFG subjectively an experience that's similar to, ultra high refresh rate gaming in the reviewer's experience? I'm much more interested in hearing about that. I'm also much more interested in hearing about the particulars of like the Founders Edition card in terms of the thermals, in terms of how it affects thermals for like your CPU, which it's exhausting hot air into essentially, things like that. Yeah. Those kinds of questions I found more interesting to me personally. But yeah, just basically saying it's 30% faster across the board. I feel like the end user can kind of extrapolate that to whatever scenario they're interested in. And as long as you see that across a range of content in a range of games with a range of utilization of techniques like ray tracing or DLSS, you can kind of get a good sense of that pretty quickly. So yeah, I mean, I think that like covering graphics cards now is much more about, I think Alex analogized it to a car where you have like this specific feature set in this specific world and universe of things you're living within, and you're kind of reviewing that as much as you're reviewing what's the performance increment on this card above the 7900 XTX, which is like not that interesting to me personally. It's much more about these transformative technologies.
Yeah, one of our most successful GPU reviews from the last generation actually was the 4060. And the reason why was obviously, you're going to compare against the 3060. There are issues there with the lack of memory, etc. But we also sort of used our bank of console equivalent settings to say, hey, can this 4060 produce a PlayStation 5-like experience? And in doing so, you actually have to tap into the features of the card in exactly the same way that developers have to innovate to get the most out of a fixed box like the PS5. So there are ways and means. I mean, I'm not sure how there's not much point comparing a PS5 to a 5080 or 5090. It's going to completely, it's going to get completely blown away. I mean, that was an interesting point that I was raising in the 5090 review. It's like, past-face cyberpunk at 4K, native 4K resolution, quote unquote, only running at 31 frames per second. And it's like, well, hang on. The PlayStation 5 is using upscaling to do RT shadows at the same frame rate. This is how far we've come with GPUs. This is like astonishing stuff. Yeah, I'm going to have a good think about this. I'm actually going to bring in a supporter question because he makes a really interesting, I was going to save it to later, but I'll do it now because it's relevant. This one comes from Yuri Grangiro, sorry. This is outrageously poor pronunciation. If latency is one half of performance, shouldn't like-for-like comparisons include frame rate and latency? Seems weird we switch to including 1% lows because they represent fluidity better but not latency, which represents latency perfectly. Cheers! Exclamation point! Funny. Exclamation point! That's actually a really good point, right? At one point, NVIDIA was putting out bar charts which showed average frame rate and average latency, which is actually a really interesting way of doing things. But where do you go there? Is it best practice from a performance perspective to be running with driver level anti-lag active? Should we activate reflex or anti-lag 2 within games and then do that? I'm thinking we kind of should, and there probably isn't a performance penalty for using anti-lag technologies. Reflex boost potentially, I think, has a small performance penalty, but when we tested it kind of didn't. So yeah, absolutely, I think we should be including latency in there. But what do you do? Obviously, when you boot a game with an AMD GPU, you get the little Radeon control panel pop up in the corner and you can turn on anti-lag. Should we be turning on anti-lag? Should it be there by default? I guess maybe I should ask AMD what they would recommend for performance testing. But I kind of see where Yuri's coming from here, and I think it's got a lot of merit to it. And we'll probably get some interesting metrics there and tied to a subjective experience. My current feeling at the moment is that you reach a point where you do notice it, and it will vary according to game type. It's so tricky, and but obviously empirical data would be very, very useful there. There's lots to talk about here, and maybe when we talk, the 5070, it is basically going to be, well, yes, if you've got a 3070 or 4070 or even a 2070, it's X% faster. So what? NVIDIA's talking about 4090. That's kind of the stake that's been thrust in the ground that we have to look at, I think. It's interesting stuff. But yes, it's high time we had a bit of a shake-up here, and it's quite interesting that now we've got this amazing technology that could just churn out tons and tons of data. But it actually turns out the more data you have, the less interesting the story becomes. Ultimately, you do just end up with one number. It's that is basically what has dominated the 5090 discourse. It's 30% faster than a 4090, and it's like, well, yeah, and what? And you talk about car reviews. It's like 0 to 60 of my cars like 4.2 seconds. So what? What next? I'm not buying the car for the specifically for how fast it gets to 60 miles an hour. Anyway, big debates. Very interested to see user comments on this. I do think there's a lot of comments being made about frame generation by people that haven't really seen it, and that's part of the challenge. We can't really show it. We can't show it. John's been testing 5090 with a 1440p 400 hertz OLED, and he's blown away by it. We can't actually show that in a video. We can show
literally impossible.
We can show off-screen photography off the screen with a frame rate counter in the corner, but John's going to be sitting here talking about how persistence blur is a thing of the past, and the user's watching it on a screen with persistence blur. It's kind of nuts, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like all those videos you made of like CRTs and stuff, and everyone's just watching this on like an LCD phone. And it's like, Jesus Christ, we are just not communicating anything at that point. It's funny.
Let's just do a road tour so people can see it in action. Anyway,
truck that like opens up.
Let's move on to the next topic. So at CES 2025, there was a kind of unannouncement of the new RDNA 4 graphics cards. Before the show, we actually had a pre-brief which had a few slides giving performance expectations and such. However, the AMD keynote came and went, and there was no actual reveal for RDNA 4 graphics cards. Kind of strange, bearing in mind that they did seem to be present at the AMD booth. Now we found out that the 9070 line, RDNA 4, is actually going to be coming out in March. Obviously a strategic move. We've got this question here from supporter who's dubbed himself question generated by Jensen GPT. And the question goes like this. AMD just quietly announced that RDNA 4 will be releasing in March. That's despite the fact that warehouses and retail stockrooms in stores around the world have RX 9000 cards right now, and a lot of them. I feel like AMD and their AIBs would not have sent these out now unless they were originally planning on releasing them in January or February, since retailers don't like holding on to stock they can't sell. My question is, seems like AMD originally wanted these around the time Blackwell launched, but something made them change their mind. Would Radeon as a brand be in a better state right now if AMD just stopped caring about NVIDIA's release cadence and just followed their own? Releasing new GPUs when the hardware and software are both 100% ready. This is what they do with CPUs for the most part. So why not GPUs? RDNA 3 ended up being pretty good in the long run, but it launched with unfinished drivers and issues, not to mention bad pricing, which tainted early reviews and hurt the brand's image. I feel like that's a lot more harmful than just waiting till everything is ready and good pricing can be figured out. Well, that's an interesting point. The thing is, that might actually be what AMD is doing by holding on to the cards. It's a strategic move. By waiting until March, then essentially AMD will know exactly what's happening with the Blackwell GPUs, the 5070, 5070 Ti, and they can change their pricing and their plans accordingly. And if there is, technical improvements happening in the background in the meantime, I can only really see that as a good thing. What do you make about this, Alex?
I mean, for me, I would like them to, like every product, actually have to be ready by launch. And I can't possibly know why. Frank Azor made mention of them wanting to adjust, I believe, kind of like adjust pricing maybe, or adjust marketing positioning and stuff like that. And I think that's all very reasonable. It doesn't necessarily help, though. Like, I think it was just a really awkward situation in general. And the reason why is I presume it's the RTX 5070 is the biggest problem. Like this weird gap between RTX 5070 and RTX 5070 Ti, where the price for the 5070, as Oliver said, seemed surprisingly reasonable. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a shocker to a lot of people, maybe AMD included. But regardless of that, I would really love to see them come out, when they do come out in March, to have a number of AMD FSR 4 titles, like a good number, like a really good solid number, and for them to say like flat out, this is just better than FSR 3. Our GPU is now scaling more towards the future. Show a bunch of games running with ray tracing that sucked on RDNA 2, but like, hey, do you have an RDNA 2 card? This is a way better card. And I would like for them to actually just start talking about the future when they do this. So I'm just like this person here. I am also want them to bring out products that are ready and not constantly adjusting price after launch, or constantly requiring new drivers to get it actually running well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oliver, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, I think that AMD's messaging on this whole thing has been a little bit confusing, and maybe they missed a step by not announcing at CES, but Obviously, I do think they gained something from understanding where NVIDIA is in terms of their sales. Are they actually selling MSRP, or are they going to be above MSRP as people are expecting, with the units possibly selling out there and retailers pricing appropriately? I'm also very interested in seeing FSR4 there at launch and in a good number of titles and in good shape, and the drivers in good shape and all that stuff, because it is frustrating also, not even just hardware products but software products, when you're reviewing games that are clearly not ready and it just feels like you as the reviewer are being done a disservice and the end consumer is being done a disservice. So if they have to hold for another 2 months, another month and a half, whatever, to get them in a reasonably good state and to have them positioned well against NVIDIA's line of products, I think that's perfectly fine. It's not like they're withholding some performance behemoth here necessarily. They're withholding something that is like a mid-range part, presumably, and hopefully will be delivering in machine learning performance and in ray tracing performance in the way that we'd like it to.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really interesting because where there is a void of information, then obviously suddenly we start to get these fantastic leaks. It happens every time, particularly like with AMD products where, there's a new NVIDIA killer coming along. And there's been, all manner of leaks for the 9070 XT, suggesting it's like up there with the 7900 XTX. I'm kind of baffled by a lot of this stuff. Because it would be the biggest generational leap AMD has ever done, possibly even more than NVIDIA has done. I mean, we're talking about, the XTX is a phenomenally capable part based on its specifications, and the specifications that we're aware of for the 9070 are actually considerably more conservative. So the only with a lower power budget, by the way. So the only explanation would be like a gigantic architectural leap, which doesn't really make sense. The slides, the paucity of information we have about RDNA 4, the CES slides were suggesting it. The top end product kind of taps out around 7900 XT level of performance, which is absolutely fine, if not great, if it's delivered at a decent price point, right? And I think that's probably what it's coming down to. AMD waiting to see what those 70 class products from NVIDIA actually do, and then having a really good discussion about pricing. The question is, pricing, it's kind of baffling because AMD don't ever seem to make any headway against NVIDIA, even when they have much better price versus performance ratios. I think we are reaching the point where obviously NVIDIA's marketing is doing great, but also the fact that we are talking about stuff that isn't based on hardware at this point. The software package that NVIDIA is delivering is first class. Actually, I was just thinking about going back to, I think it was maybe the Maxwell Editors Day, where they were talking about stuff like TurfWorks, NVIDIA TurfWorks. And it's like all of these sort of technologies, these black box technologies that NVIDIA wanted to add to developer games, which weren't, that great and, didn't really make a difference. Now we are where we are, where we're looking at these amazing neural rendering demos, where we're seeing the DLSS transformer model being released, and the response based on what I'm seeing online is only positive. So, there's just a completely different arms race at this point. And it is a question of, are these features nice to have or essential? And I think, DLSS has moved from a nice to have to an essential part of the GPU, to the point where if you've got a 20 series card, would you really want a GPU that doesn't have DLSS? And I think, that's the main challenge facing FSR4. It's a battle on many fronts, because I think the quality, based on what you saw with Ratchet, is well up there, right? I mean, this was fantastic stuff. I mean, it was actually highly fortuitous, Alex, that the demo that they showed was basically the game that you use to highlight all of the problems that reconstruction-based technologies have, and it kind of came out with flying colors, right? But they're still going to be behind on support. How do you do that? Do you have some sort of unofficial DLSS wrapper that takes those DLSS inputs and puts them into FSR4? How do you, because NVIDIA has basically invested in DLSS for what, coming up on 7 years now. How do you catch up with that? I think there's a really big sort of question that AMD has to answer here. I mean, thoughts? Where do you go? If you've got great hardware that's great priced and it's not working, where do you go next?
Well, I actually love the idea of an AMD-sponsored wrapper for DLL's calls to DLSS to get around, because I think the issue is that it requires FSR 4 is going to require a game to have at least FSR 3.1.
Yeah,
and that's not a lot of titles, because that's when they like fully officially switched to a DLL model, I believe, and. Yeah, if they could get around that, and I think it wouldn't be below AMD, because I think at least on the GPU programming side of things, they are actually now kind of taking advantage of CUDA's marketplace and software packaging, like building off of that, and them doing that as well too for FSR 4. I think it would be amazing, because then you could get it into a whole bunch of other really old titles that never had FSR 4. You could get it into Control. You could get it into, I don't think it's also in stuff like Metro Exodus. It's not in a lot of titles. And I find that idea fascinating, Rich. Yeah. I would like to see that.
It's all the more fascinating from an NVIDIA's owner perspective, because with the NVIDIA app, they're literally injecting new DLSS into old DLSS games going back to like 2020. And this is kind of remarkable, where you can buy a GPU. I mean, obviously, when you buy a new GPU, you expect higher performance levels, right? But what you don't expect is to be able to increase the image quality of games that released like 4 or 5 years ago. This is like pretty nuts stuff. It's super good. I love to see it. It just highlights. It's one highlight of how software is making a difference now in ways which we just aren't really appreciating, possibly in reviews. I just love the way that Cyberpunk comes out with a new transformer model, and people are now testing the transformer model on games we didn't have access to in the
we
review
didn't have
period. Yeah,
it's great.
Yeah, that DLL
New
model
Frontier
has been transformative.
Yeah, New Frontier here. I would also, just like you though, Rich, everything you said, I 100% agree with it. Just AMD, like, it's a tough position, and the software aspect side of things is so much more overriding and important now, even for legacy GPU parts. Like, it wasn't in the past that you had a GeForce, 4200 Ti, and then 6 years later, a GPU would release that makes your GPU better. Like, your GeForce 4200 Ti was actually in the waste bin of history by this point in time. It wouldn't get better over time. So it's like, it's a totally weird situation. And I think AMD just needs to embrace some of the NVIDIA strategies. And they've been doing a good, I think FSR 4 is going to be like their first really big splash in this regard. Okay. Anti-lag, unfortunately, had this abortive launch.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just going back to that latency discussion we had. It's like the whole sort of latency issue's barely been touched on in reviewing, but it is actually quite important. I'm actually quite interested to see what baseline latency is between vendors, even if the game is actually running at the same frame rate. That's going to be quite interesting. We're talking about the latency hit of DLSS 4, right? But how many people are actually turning on the anti-lag control panel feature in both NVIDIA and AMD GPU control panels? Why? It's just kind of bizarre to me. There's this kind of big sort of grey area about latency, which we haven't really got enough data on. Okay, next news story, and this one, wow, I just don't know what to make of this. There was wide-scale disbelief amongst the audience on this one, but it's been revealed that 2 games as a service projects from the Sony first-party studios have been cancelled. Those games are in development at Bend Studio, and remarkably, Bluepoint Games. One of them has been confirmed. Bluepoint was apparently working on a live service God of War game. Let's just have a moment of hushed awe for that particular concept and the idea that Bluepoint was doing that. They're not happening now. Years of work potentially wasted, similar to what happened with the Naughty Dog Factions game for The Last of Us. Oliver, I'd love your opinions on this, because this seems look, we don't really know what's happening here. We don't know the full story, but the concept that Bluepoint was working on a live service God of War game, I find that to be, is it mismanagement even? It doesn't sound like a good idea at the very least, does it?
It seems kind of malicious to put such a talented group of people who are responsible for producing some of the best remaster remake projects of all time, in my opinion, on a live service God of War game. I don't even know where to start with that, but I think it's a bit of a shame that Sony went down this path and wasted the talents of some of their biggest developers, because so far we've had Bluepoint, Naughty Dog, and Bend Studio working on big games, live service games that have all been canceled in roughly the last year. And then there are a number of smaller studios as well, like Deviation Games. There was a game from London Studios. Obviously, they got shut down. There was a Twisted Metal game. There was a Destiny spin-off. There was Insomniac's Spider-Man Great Web, the Great Web game, which I don't know how
Oh my goodness.
deep into production that was, but it was certainly canceled. And now, you look at Sony's upcoming lineup and it's like, okay, Ghost of Yorte, Wolverine, Death Stranding 2, Intergalactic. That's not bad by any means, but it, is probably thinner than it should be, considering the efforts of some of these studios. In some cases, they were working for, I think the God of War game was reportedly in development for 4 years. That's a crazy amount of time to be working on a game for it to be canceled, I think. Obviously, single-player games can have their ups and downs, and some of them do get canceled, but it seems like these live service titles, they take a longer amount of time to break that concept and to figure out if it works. And then if it doesn't work, you're kind of out a lot of development resources. And if it, if ultimately you do make it and it does hit like Helldivers 2, that's great. But you have one massive hit and then several games that are in production for several years that get canceled. And one game that got launched kind of abortively, famously, and got killed there with Concord. So yeah, I mean, on some level I understand it, and that games are taking so long to make and so many resources to make, and the conventional model of making single player games isn't working out, at least in the current margin. Now maybe you look forward a few years, maybe the incredible progress in things like large language models, maybe you can push things out a little bit faster and do things better. But yeah, I mean, for now, it just seems like kind of a bit of a dire situation, but I don't think the Sony approach was the right approach. In retrospect, I almost think the Microsoft approach was a little bit better, and I think we're seeing some of the fruits of that possibly with titles like Doom, The Dark Ages, completely eschewing multiplayer whatsoever. There's no multiplayer in Doom, The Dark Ages, and titles like that are coming out. A large number of titles coming to Game Pass published by Microsoft this year that are all looking pretty nice relative to Sony's mooted lineup possibly into this year and the next.
Mm-hmm. Alex?
Wow. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall of the meeting where they're like, these guys make incredible remasters, but how about a looter God of War games as a service? I really would love to know who pitched it, because it almost seems like I could not physically imagine anyone from Bluepoint themselves pitching it. So it seems very strange to me. And I feel like the titles that really are breakout successes in the games as a service genre have an entire studio culture and history and group of designers and artists who've worked in these similar fields before. And they kind of there's a random element too. I wouldn't have necessarily expected something like Helldivers 2 to do as well as it did in comparison to other games that do similar things. But lo and behold, it was. So there is a random element here, but I just don't think you can just throw this type of workload at every studio. There are people who are specialists at it. And there's that, once again, that lack of mind. There's only so many games as a service games that can exist. And then you read stories online about okay, so now this new Marvel game is blowing up right now. What is it called?
Marvel Rivals.
Marvel Rivals, that's blowing up. But then something like Apex Legends is going down in terms of how many numbers it has. So there's obviously a shifting core demographic that is moving over time eventually to other titles or just giving up totally. So there's this lack, you can only fight for a certain size of the market. And I don't think throwing every single studio like Sony did at this was at all the right idea. In fact, it sounded really bad. And that was obviously not their core strength before. It was in the PS4 gen and late PS3 gen. It was 100% core gamer titles with single player narratives, right? So it feels totally like absolute wrong decision. And it makes me sad too, because we won't see anything from Bluepoint or Bend presumably now for a long time.
Yeah.
Right? Like they'll just skip the generation at this point, Bend, right?
Well,
so
unless there's, like multiple teams within the developer doing different things, which is a possibility.
Maybe.
Of course.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to make of all of this. I just think, Bluepoint acquired by Sony, this was like lauded at the time. Obviously, the Demon's Souls remake was like astonishingly good stuff, but just their body of work across the years has been phenomenal. And the concept that they'd do a God of War game, I mean, I kind of thought that maybe they would develop their own IP, put their talents, their obvious talents to use in creating something new and exciting, as opposed to, an offshoot of an existing game with a concept that just sounds highly questionable from the outset. Baffling. Bend Studio, I guess we don't really know what they are up to with their particular project. But, still thinking that the idea that the Days Gone franchise was basically terminated, probably a bad idea. It sold really well on PC. I think it actually sold pretty well on PlayStation as well. There's plenty that they could have done with the new generation. You're quite right. We're actually seeing the possibility that we won't actually see any game from these developers this generation, which is quite staggering when you think about it. I don't really know what more to say about this. I'm just thinking back to Astrobot and the vibes you got off that, which was, it was a reminder of when Sony put out a diverse portfolio of games of different sizes, concept-driven, still delivering those AAA juggernauts, but, experimental, curious, exciting. And, to see, Bluepoint doing a God of War live service game, rather astonishing stuff. I can't quite get my head around this, but it's not good, is it? Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to supporter Q&A, in fact, which is the part of the show where every week I ask our supporters for questions to pose to the team, and I choose the best ones, or rather the ones that we're best equipped to answer. We've already gone through a lot of them based on the sheer volume of RTX 5000 questions we had. But let's talk about this one from Noah Pankratz. Hello, my DF dandies. I'm curious to know your thoughts on the leaked Switch 2 motherboard. Is it possible there is custom hardware attached that we still don't know about, possibly with some kind of specialized function? Perhaps a specialty chip that can perform dedicated hardware upscaling like those featured in smart TVs in conjunction with whatever DLSS flavor Nintendo uses. This could help reduce the CPU, GPU, or CUDA-core workloads. Or could there be some other specialized hardware features we still have no idea about? It sort of irks me when people say authoritatively that we already know all there is to know about the hardware. Even if they're somewhat predictable at times, Nintendo does seem to consistently keep us on our toes, which I personally don't appreciate as a non-ballerina. Again, I would just like to hear your thoughts. Thanks for what your team does to keep us informed and entertained. First-time questioner, long-time bespoker. Cheers! ! Yeah, I mean, we often talk about the concept of the extra GPU in the power brick, or the dual layer ESRAM, classic rumors from yesteryear where, facts appear about hardware specifications and people just can't quite accept them. The thing about having like specialized functions on a separate board is basically the concept of data transfer. It's hugely inefficient to actually send all of that data to and from a completely different board, even to a completely different chip on the same board. So this kind of limits the performance and the win that you get out of that. What does interest me about the Switch 2 is the USB-C port on the top of the unit, which kind of suggests that there could be some like fun peripherals that are coming in due course, which maybe we don't know about. Oliver, what do you make of this particular question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's much need for dedicated hardware for scaling in particular, because you have DLSS, something like FSR1 can be run with a pretty negligible cost if you need some spatial upscaling beyond that. You're already packing a 200 millimeter squared, fairly modern chip in there. think it's probably flexible enough to do what you need there. I do think they're probably using some specialized legacy hardware to read Switch 1 cartridges. I think that's a die, a little chip that's confirmed to possibly be for that purpose. People speculate about that. But I think the point of differentiation in the Switch 2 is not going to come from what's in the motherboard. It's going to come from, I mean, outside of obviously the new Tegra chip there. I think it's going to come from like the new hardware functionality with the optical sensor, with the mouse. Maybe you'll see some hardware peripherals to make that a little bit more comfortable. That's going to come from whatever they end up doing with that top USB-C port. I agree it is like intriguing. I don't know that we've seen any leaks or rumors that are specifically attached to the purpose of that top USB-C port, but I think it would be very uncharacteristic of Nintendo to stick something like that on there and just have it be a more convenient way to charge the device when playing portably. I think that's unlikely personally. That's going to be part of it for sure, but I would also expect them to use some kind of peripheral at some point, maybe some kind of camera, something like that, who knows. So yeah, I think that I wouldn't really be looking at the motherboard. I'd be looking at the external shell of the device to give me some clues as to what they might do over the Switch 2's lifespan.
Yeah. Alex, has there ever been any example of like a specialist hardware on a daughter board? That, I mean, if you think about PC, there's stuff like PhysX and whatnot and sound cards. But typically graphics is on the graphics card unless there was like SLI, stuff like that. It just doesn't really make sense for a console. But is there any scenario where this conceit has value?
No, I don't think. I think you put it like especially for real time stuff nowadays, and the fact that we use systems on a chip, which was pioneered at some point in history. So I feel like that is just computing. That's something that would have been done in the past. Around like last time was probably like the PS3 generation where that was a big deal, and I don't see it anymore as a game changer or something that you'd even want to target.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, you have the expansion pack, obviously. That's
a great one.
That's one thing I was thinking of. And then also, you never know. I mean, I think you'd probably know by now because we have seen the motherboard, but maybe one of those USB Type-C ports is a Thunderbolt port and you get a PCIe expansion. And that would presumably be used to service the mooted GPU and the power brick, of course. That's very important for Nintendo.
Yes.
So,
and the dual layer ESRAM.
It all makes sense.
Like there could, if they wanted to wire this up with like an extra however many dollars of electronics, they could probably accommodate something that would be ambitious for communication here that would actually work. But that would, I don't think Nintendo's going to do that. I don't really think so.
Yeah, the GPU in the dock is the other classic, isn't it?
Yes.
Extra GPU in the dock, which is an interesting idea, but ultimately that GPU in the dock would also need its own memory, and it would also need to be a particularly large chip to be meaningfully better than the one in the Switch itself. It would be very, very difficult to have them actually work in concert together. So you might as well just produce a home console with a bigger chip at that point. It's all a bit. It's not a goer. Okay, so next question. This one from Alan, the immortal, legendary Alan from the Discord. Hi, guys. Apparently some gaming corpos think GTA 6 will be $100, and this will, quote-unquote, save gaming because it will allow others to follow with $100 being the new normal for games, exclamation point. I can see GTA 6 being $100 as it will be a huge game, but it would be hard for others to follow, surely. Well, it's an interesting question because they probably could charge $100 for GTA 6. Whether that's a good idea or not, I don't know. But they are going to be selling many, many, many millions of it, regardless of how much they price it at. So they're going to make a lot of money on it, whether it's like a $70, $80 or $100 game. The question of other games becoming more expensive, I seem to recall, I might be wrong about this, Oliver, but I seem to recall that in the massive Insomniac leak, there was this concept that games could be split into different parts that would, that could, basically mean that the cumulative cost of buying the complete package would increase. But what do you think about Alan's question more generally?
I think it's probably a question about what moves the most dollars, and I don't know. To me, I could see paying $100 for GTA 6 for sure, but there's going to be a range of responses to a game like GTA 6. Like some people would be willing to pay $20 for it. Some people would probably be willing to pay $500 for it, a really high price. And if you price above $70 USD, I think it's going to leave a bit of a bad taste in a lot of players' mouths. So I'm not sure that it maximizes profit to sell the $100 or $80 or $90. It might maximize profit to just sell the standard asking clearing price for games nowadays, which is either 60 or 70, more often 70 now, US dollars. But I mean, I think there is probably a legitimate conversation. I mean, it's not a great conversation, but it's a legitimate conversation to have about like game pricing, and should it be more variable, and should we have like this level where the new Call of Duty, say, with all of its content is priced at, $10 or $20 above a title like a Spider-Man or something, or an Astrobot that might have less content. People certainly can have that argument. To me, I don't really see it that way personally. I tend to like the games that have less content but higher quality content than the games that might be packed full of like all this different games as a service stuff. But I mean, I think it's a legitimate conversation to have, but I don't think GTA will be the game to rip off that Band-Aid necessarily. I think they could, but I don't think they will.
Okay. Alex, thoughts?
I think GTA could maybe do it in the aspect of GTA 6 Online is somehow separate. I don't know how they would do it, but I imagine they could have multiple tiered product release with the core story, and then later on you buy an expansion pack to the story that also unlocks GTA Online or something. I have no idea. I imagine they could somehow do this, but I don't in the end think that's going to happen. The price of games in general, though, like there was obviously inflation keeps occurring, and so it doesn't make sense that all products just stay the same static price forever, including games. But at the same time, as things go up in price, they start conflicting with like other buying decisions, and so I think there's a really strong balance that needs to be met and hit there to actually make it worthwhile. I'm just looking at I don't want to pick on the game necessarily, but Doom the Dark Ages to pre-order it on Steam is €80. And that's the base version of the game. There's no version below it. So €80 for Doom the Dark Ages. That is a modern AAA single player only title. I think it's going to have a lot of stuff in it, and it's going to be very high quality, but this isn't a Call of Duty, right? So we already see other games increasing the base price, and I think it's just going to keep happening more and more for different game types, but not for your Concords. Obviously, they should have probably released that for free.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in the end, they did.
They did. Yeah.
They were funded.
What to make of this one? I think basically there's a vast range of monetization models, but what you don't want to do is actually alienate people from buying your game in the first place, which increasing the ticket price would do. There's a lot of ways that that publishers are actually getting us to spend more money on games, mechanisms we've never seen before in the past. For example, Game Pass, you pay your subscription, you expect at day one access to the games, right? That's what they're offering. Except you can actually pay like $30 more to play it 5 days early. And it's like,
crazy.
Well, what is day one anymore? Presumably day one is when you can actually play the game, except day one is actually the game only available if you pay the extra money. And that's before we get into stuff like season passes and other things, and deluxe editions, gold, ultimate tier editions, that sort of thing. So, I expect to see more of a kind of publishers trying to pluck the golden goose without upsetting it, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the final question of the show. And this one's quite interesting. It comes from Ryan Luca. As Sony prepares for their next console, should the cross-gen period extend for the Pro line of consoles only? If you purchased a PS5 Pro last year, for example, should you expect 6 years of game support or 2 to 3 years until roughly the next generation? He supplied a link to TechSpot, which actually includes news that I hadn't seen. And basically the link is saying that well-known tipster Kepler L2 who, to be fair, had a pretty good track record of PS5 Pro leaks. He was saying that the PS6 SoC is coming soon in terms of development. A0 tape-out scheduled for late this year, apparently based on the UDNA architecture, which is no real surprise. I mean, everybody is basically gearing up for this kind of new hybrid age of rendering that includes AI. Anyway, 2 SoCs there apparently. I think we could assume maybe the other one is for the handheld. But even so, Alex, what do you make of this particular question? I mean, basically what Ryan is suggesting is something that you've talked about in the past, which is essentially that consoles no longer have generations, but basically become iterative improvements released in, every 3 years or so.
Yes, I think that is the general path, and I think that's what Sony's going to do, but I do not think they would limit it just to PS5 Pro. On a technical level, nearly everything PS5 Pro can do, PS5 can do at a lower resolution. And at a lower frame rate, maybe. So the CPU is so similar, and that is the main thing that dictates like your frame rate target and frame rate stability and all those things. So I think there's no reason why something that launches on PS5 Pro could not launch on PS5. And even then, when you look at the numbers, like Rich has gone across back compatibility titles, PS5 Pro isn't actually a huge upgrade in a lot of ways, right? So it's the subjective difference of getting PSSR that seems to be the main thing driving that console at the moment. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's how I feel about that. But I fully expect a much more, it's going to be like the first 3 years to 4 years of this gen, but maybe even longer. I don't really know. It depends on how much they expect to sell, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think cross-gen is going to continue simply because it makes financial sense. As to whether it's the PS5 Pro only that continues to get support, I don't think there's enough PS5 Pros that are going to be out there to justify that. So I think it will just happen because it's cross-gen, and you might get an enhanced PS5 Pro version. But I think that the support for PS5 Pro will disappear at the same time that the support for the PlayStation 5 disappears. You can make a similar case for Xbox One X, for example. That was a phenomenally good machine in 2017. It could have lasted a lot longer, really, but, it's part of the Xbox One family, so it was phased out with Xbox One. What do you reckon, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo those sentiments. It doesn't make sense because you're still working with a Zen 2 CPU, similar amount of RAM. Obviously, the Pro is a better GPU, but graphics famously scale quite well. And then, of course, the PS5, I would assume, will probably be like 80%, maybe more of PS5 sold through a generation, I'd assume. So those are some factors that just make it a lot more sensible to continue to ship on PS5 as well as PS5 Pro. But then, of course, I think critically here, you have a handheld possibly in the works that could be a lot closer to a base PS5 in terms of spec. Might actually be behind it in some critical respects. So if you're thinking about like, okay, we're going to ship on PS6 home console, PS6 portable, PS5, PS5 Pro, that looks like a pretty even mix of hardware platforms there, with PS5 and the PS6 handheld being at a baseline level there. Obviously, the kind of odd man out is the PS5 in terms of machine learning capability, but I assume they can have some fallbacks and have some worse graphics there, and that should be okay. I think there will be a long cross-gen period, longer than this cross-gen period, which itself was a long cross-gen period, and I expect it will include PS5. I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, given the amount of resources that are put into modern games and given the amount of consoles they have to target, if that cross-gen period didn't extend for like 5 or 6 years into the next gen, it basically encompassed the entire generation. That would be my claim as something that could be plausible there.
That seems reasonable.
Yeah,
to me
I think that
at
could
this
be
point.
plausible.
Yeah.
This text bot feature that Ryan linked to here kind of sums up all of the PlayStation 6 leaks to date. And they're suggesting that PlayStation 6 will be using the UDNA architecture from AMD. And that's what's kind of interesting to me because, well, what can I say? I mean, Microsoft is hinting heavily that they're talking about, well, the biggest technological leap we've ever seen. when we know that they can't do it just by increasing the size of the silicon. I mean, the question is, what is UDNA? It's a unification of RDNA and what's the other one? CDNA.
CDNA.
Yeah. But, it's all based around the kind of notion that the concept of rendering and game graphics is going to be moving into a different hybrid age. We had a taste of that with some of the NVIDIA stuff that we saw at CES 2025. So, yeah, interesting stuff. And I'm wondering to the extent where cross-gen will actually be possible to the same degree. Maybe we would have very different looking games if this new generation is kicking in with very different neural rendering features. How do you think this will play out, Alex?
Wow. Well, I think those that have the largest research divisions and largest investment in GPU servers that are running models will have a distinct advantage versus their peers. And I feel it's a weird situation where Sony is not big enough by its lonesome to, for example, compete with the stuff we saw at the NVIDIA booth. Seriously. And I'd say that just being reasonable in terms of resources. There's all these engineers and they're spending all this time only doing research into totally groundbreaking graphical stuff. That is not the concern that a Sony has as a publisher, for example, right?
Yeah.
And that is, I feel like this is a weird thing where Sony, Microsoft, and AMD, maybe there should be more collusion there to even Amethyst should be really pumped up then to make that a really viable future for them, because all those really transformative techniques that may be enabled by a machine learning hardware, they need to be first developed and they need to be in-house versions, because you can be sure as hell that NVIDIA is not going to share them. So so that's a weird, I don't know what that looks like actually at the moment.
I think actually the one thing from this leak that I think is actually interesting here, and it might be more forward-looking than you might have expected, is the fact that they're going to be using 2nm process technology, a mix of 3 and 2nm process technology, it sounds like here, Zen 6 and UDNA, and targeting a 2027 launch potentially, given the tape-out regime here. That seems like a very interesting and possibly quite forward-looking console. And indeed, if UDNA is a very competent machine learning and ray tracing architecture that can compete with NVIDIA to some greater degree than what we've seen from AMD architectures in the past, then launching with that degree of an aggressive timescale could really, I think, be an actually compelling box in 2027 in perhaps a way that the PS5 was not necessarily in 2020 with its reliance on earlier technologies there. So that could be more interesting possibly, given what we know about the console.
Yeah, another thing that was in this TechSpot report was a comment from Chip Hell forum there, which often emerges with some interesting leaks, discussing the potential adoption of 3D Vcache technology. Now, obviously, this has been really transformative to CPU performance in the PC space. The Vcache parts from AMD have just been astonishingly good. 9800X3D, brilliant. However, I mean, we've got to remember, and we've said this before on the Directs because people have come up with this idea in the past. We've got to remember that consoles are designed to be very efficient, area-efficient boxes. So they can't be, they don't have the money to spend on premium components such as, 3D Vcache. It's like I said to you, Alex, surely Mark Cerny would be saying to developers, look, we've given you these caches on die. Please use them. Please be a bit more efficient in how they're used. But I'm sure it would actually produce a much better increase to, a significant increase to CPU performance in the same way that it has on the PC side. But that's not really the way. That's not really the philosophy behind consoles. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Did you? I mean, looking at these? I mean, Oliver, you've literally spoken to Mark Cerny. You've got some idea of the man. Particularly when he was talking about PlayStation 5 Pro. Does any of the stuff that you picked up on tie in? I mean, obvious with what we're reading here, obviously stuff like UDNA seems like a good fit, right, for what he's talking about in terms of the future, which is essentially less about overloading on shaders, more about tapping into enhanced ray tracing and machine learning.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect this would logically follow, very much so. But I also would tend to agree that a 3D V cache would not make a whole lot of sense, in part because of cost and complexity reasons, and also like even when you see it working on PC in a lot of games and giving you that performance uplift, it's like maybe a 20% performance uplift over the non 3D V cache parts, maybe a little bit more in some titles in that range, right? So I don't really think that's compelling to a console designer. Now the idea of the GPU tapping into that as well, maybe that's a little bit more compelling, but like when we talk about going from a PS4 to a PS5 in terms of CPU performance, we're talking about a like 3 times multiple, a lot of software, right? That's a very different kind of console level improvement. And I think you're going to get a lot of CPU improvement just from going to Zen 6 from Zen 2. I think it's going to be a big improvement. I don't really think you need the 3D V cache there. But for sure, like UDNA, if it's all it's mooted to be, if it's manufactured at these process technologies, if it launches in 2027, a lot of elements are there to make for a really compelling console potentially, and to make a console that's following with what Mark laid out sort of cryptically as a future for graphics technology / a future for PlayStation 6 probably, when he spoke to me back in October.
Yeah. Devil's advocate though, Alex, you've basically been saying that AMD's been getting a lot of performance increases across the board simply by introducing caches.
Yeah, that's how they've done it. So it's going to be interesting to see what UDNA does to, at least on the console side, to really circumvent that. I still think they're going to do Infinity Cache on the PC because it seems to do really well for them. But I'm also curious, what do you think, guys? Like, they debuted RDNA 2 on console. Will they debut UDNA on console as well? Like, it took a while to get RDNA 2 parts on PC. You know,
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, it was interesting that RDNA 2 basically debuted at the same time on PC as it did on consoles. And it was equally bizarre when, I was sitting in a pre-brief for RDNA 1 in Los Angeles with AMD at a conference, and literally, Phil Spencer was talking about RDNA 2 at E3 next door. So that was a bit weird. It may well be, I don't know, we have no idea of the roadmap, really. I mean, you'd expect that with NVIDIA pulling ahead on machine learning, that AMD would want to catch up as quickly as possible, right? Guess we'll just have to wait and see. Okay, that was the final question, therefore, the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance that you did enjoy it. Ring bells for notifications and algorithm boosts for us. Store.digitalfoundry.net for our merchandising wares. But yeah, DF supporter program, that is really important. It enables a lot of things for us. So please do consider that. Early access to the Direct, early access to a bunch of stuff, our amazing community, news updates from the team, etc., etc. But that's all from us for this week. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and we'll see you next week.